Hi, smart moms and dads. Welcome to another episode of the Brainy Moms podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Amy Moore, and I am joined by my co-host, Sandy Zamalis. And Sandy and I are excited to bring you a conversation with two pediatricians today. They are co-authors of the book, Digging into Nature, Outdoor Adventures for Happier and Healthier Kids. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Pooja Tandon. She's a general pediatrician and researcher who has published widely on the importance of physical activity, outdoor time, and nature contact for health. She lives in the Seattle area with her husband and two children. And we also have Dr. Danette Glassy, a retired primary care pediatrician who now leads the Project Nature Initiative, a program to support pediatric medical professionals as they encourage children to spend time in nature. Dr. Glassy lives in the Seattle area as well and enjoys exploring nature in the Pacific Northwest with her two grandchildren. Welcome, Dr. Glassy and Dr. Tandon.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Great to be here.
So we always like to start off by having our guests talk about how they got interested in their specific topic. And this particular topic, outdoor play, we've not actually ever done on our podcast. So we're really excited about bringing this topic to the podcast. Could you both share the stories that you kind of opened up your book with and talk a little bit about how you became engaged in this topic and Project Nature?
After my long career, 30 years in pediatrics, for pediatricians, the idea of nature time also is somewhat new, but it was starting to bubble up a little bit, especially as children were being indoors more, less outdoor activity, and certainly more screen time. And about that time that I was hearing about parks prescriptions and physicians being involved in this, I had this patient come in for her kindergarten checkup. She was 6, and I always asked, "What do you like to do outside?" And this little girl rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, Dr. Glassy, I'm not an outdoor girl." And of course, we all kind of laughed. It was very dramatic. But her parents jumped in right away. Oh, we're so proud of her. She's already coding. She does so much on the computer. And it really struck me, my gosh, how can you fault that? But I don't even know what to say. I've been in practice all these years, and how do I help this family find balance for this girl? Because it doesn't sound like she has much balance right now. Fast forward then with the opportunity to be able to investigate this and spread it to other pediatricians, meeting up with Dr. Tandon, the research mind, so that we could really perfect the messages we were giving other pediatricians and pediatric practitioners. And as we were doing that, decided to also reach parents directly with our new book, Digging into Nature.
Dr. Tandon, how about you?
Yeah, so I've been a pediatrician for over 20 years and a researcher for more than half of that, focused on getting kids moving, sort of physical activity and healthy movement behaviors. But for me, I think what really inspired this work was being a mother to two children who I was, as they were little and I was realizing what childhood looked like today, where children were increasingly drawn to screens, where the indoors were just so comfortable and challenging to sometimes navigate, two boisterous boys and their behaviors, that I found myself having an easier time parenting when my children were outdoors. And I started thinking about that and connecting in my mind the idea that I grew up outdoors. I spent a lot of time outdoors, but I spent a lot of it in India and not in typical ways that people think of outdoors or outdoorsy here. I wasn't camping and hiking, but I spent a lot of time on gardens and parks and rooftop terraces, and so that kind of came together for me. And as a researcher, I took that on to really focus on what do we know, what's missing as far as nature contact and health. And health defined in all the broadest ways, the physical health, mental health, and learning, and found that there is a substantial body of evidence around this, and wanted to bring that awareness to my colleagues first. So we've been focusing a lot on other researchers and pediatricians, and teaming up with Dr. Glassy to really bring this information to parents and families.
So our listeners know that in addition to being a psychologist, I'm also a clinical researcher. And so I have, of course, read your 2021 review in pediatrics. And so distill that down a little bit for us. What's behind the medical evidence in that spending time in nature improves health and well-being of children? Are we primarily talking about mental health, or is something happening physically as well? What have you found?
Yeah, so that review process was a big paper, and luckily the pandemic gave me lots of time to work with colleagues on that. We started with over 10,000 studies and distilled it down, and eventually reviewed about 300. And we found that the evidence is broad. Like, there are many areas of health that are supported by being time in nature, with the most compelling evidence in two categories, and that's for physical activity and mental health. And so these are the two areas where we found the most amount of studies, the most rigorous studies, that spending time in nature, or even living in neighborhoods that have nature nearby, living in with parks in your community, or trees that are in your neighborhood or in your schoolyard, kind of a range of different types of nature exposures can lead to benefits as far as children moving more and reporting fewer symptoms of things like, fewer depressive symptoms or stress or anxiety. And then benefits in other realms too, such as, musculoskeletal health and healthier weight status. Symptoms of ADHD might be better for children after they spend time in nature. So what's really an amazing thing about, we as pediatricians, we can prescribe so many different types of treatments, but the cool thing about nature time is that there's evidence that it can prevent a whole range of health problems, and in some cases even be part of the treatment for other health conditions.
It's so fascinating to me that this is a topic, because it seems like it would be common sense that kids should play in order to learn. And I know, Dr. Glassy, you want to chime in, but just one of the things that I'd like you both to address is, what do you think has caused this change, that we need to be reminded that being outside is so beneficial to our children's health and well-being?
Well, I would say just that there has been such an explosion of electronics, and also the idea in parenting that you really need to expose your children to so many things that they get scheduled out as well. When we started to bring these messages to the pediatricians, and they then, all of us then to our families, what we were hearing back is, nobody would say no to going outside necessarily, but there's all these competing things. And so really trying to understand the barrier of time, being able to find the time to catch a little nature. And so learning what are the tricks that other families have come to. What about communities? Is there a community solution? Like, making your schoolyard or your childcare more nature influenced. Weather, we have a lot of rain in the Northwest, and it's little spitty rain. It's not that deluge that some places get, but families often say, well, we're not going to go out, it's rainy again, blah blah blah. And really thinking about the kinds of equipment and clothing that you would wear to be comfortable in all kinds of weather. And safety was the third one that really said, parents were concerned about sending their children to the park or sending them outside to play. Going to the park and finding out that it made you uncomfortable, perhaps because you just didn't feel safe there, or there were in our area just east of the city, there's sometimes of the year a lot of bears around, even in people's yards, and so wild animals or whatnot. So really kind of thinking about the barriers that are keeping people from choosing it, but also really head on the time and helping families think about prioritizing nature and nature time, and maybe whittling down some of those other commitments or screen time to eke out that time. Dr. Tandon likes to talk about your extended families as well. Maybe Pooja, you can pick it up there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that I think families, they're trying their best. Most families want the best for their children. They want to have their children be healthier, but there are so many competing priorities, and so we are really just trying to elevate the idea that, like, bring back, like you said, I think it's something that our grandparents and ancestors and in most cultures knew, that spending time in nature is good for us, and the fresh air and all of that. And um, but how do we bring that back into childhood when there are so many competing priorities? And we try to problem solve with families and share solutions we've learned. And one of them is really thinking about not just the parents, like what is that village that I think maybe that's a cultural shift, a societal shift that's happened, that a lot of parenting is left into a nuclear unit. And if we can lean on our neighbors and our grandparents and our teachers and others to really think about, when are those possibilities when children could spend time in nature, and it doesn't always have to be with their nuclear family.
So I want to differentiate here between the importance of physical activity and the importance of time in nature, because there's a huge difference here, right? And so you talk a lot about, well, they can coincide, right? And time in nature can lead to physical activity outside, right? But can you talk a little bit about what's happening at the cellular level? What's happening at the hormonal level? Like when we put our bare feet in the grass, what is that doing for us? I mean, you mentioned, there are Nordic cultures who let their babies take a nap every day outside, no matter the temperature. They just wrap them up warmly, and there are those of us in America going, what? There's no way. And so why do we want this for our kids?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a question of like mechanism. And so I'm going to put on that science brain here and answer that a little bit in the sense of like, okay, so you're saying that nature is good for kids, like why is it? And there's probably there are many different reasons and pathways that have been proposed, and one of them is physical activity. So when children are outdoors, when any of us are outdoors, we're more likely to be moving than we are when we're indoors. And that's one way, because we know movement is good for us. It gets our heart pumping, our bones and muscles moving. And that's one way that we can experience benefits, just because we're likely to move when we're outdoors. But you're right, you can move in a gym, on a treadmill, but there are other ways. And I think part of that includes things like the access to what's in nature. So there's this idea of forest bathing, and scientists have studied this. So when you're surrounded by trees or immersed in nature, you're being exposed to essentially like the essential oils, these organic compounds that the trees release to fight off infections for themselves, that when we inhale them, they actually boost our immune system. So there's evidence that there's sort of this boost to our immunity, that there's this kind of idea of attention restoration, that our brain only has so much capacity to take in information. And when we are in nature, especially in immersive nature experiences, our brain capacity is sort of restored. And that's probably the reason for many of the mental health and cognitive benefits. And, usually as children, you're not in nature by yourself. So young children may be there with, caring adults, family members. Other children may be there with peers or intergeneration. And so there's that social capital, the social piece of that there's increasing evidence that's good for our health. So I think there's sort of these different pathways, better air quality, reduction of noise pollution. So many different ways that being in nature can be good for us, including the movement and the immune system and social capital.
Dr.
And
Glassy?
yeah, those are many of the things that research has actually quantified and verified for us. But also, as parents, we need that restorative time. We need that fresh air. We need that change in venue. Dr. Tandon mentioned that, that she felt like it was easier to parent two very active young boys outside. And so nature also is this spectacular and on-inducing setting to be a parent in and expose your child to as well. So it's not as quantified in the research, but your child has so many tasks that they're doing as they get their new developmental milestones, they grow their social emotional resilience. All of that just seems to be enhanced when you're doing that kind of parenting, exposing your children that way, promoting those developmental milestones in the setting of in a natural setting. And we use it very broadly. That might be this beautiful, spectacular view with trees and whatnot, or it may be a rooftop terrace or the collection of plants you have in your apartment or whatever. Go ahead, Pooja.
I was going to speak to this idea of green exercise. So there is research that, for example, if you run on a treadmill compared to running on a trail that's in nature, so there's that physical activity might be the same, but they found that the sort of adjunct benefits to kind of your mental health, to your restorative capacity is higher when you're in a natural setting. And most of those studies are in adults, but to kind of more directly answer your question about, you can move in a lot of different places and in a lot of different ways, but when you're in nature, there's evidence that there's something extra happening to your that benefits your mental health.
So is there any evidence to support what we're seeing about this idea of grounding, this idea of when our feet are on the beach, when our feet are in bare grass? Is there any evidence to support that? We see this on social media all the time, right? Oh, I feel so much better now that I'm grounded, right? Like speak to that.
I was hoping Dr. Tandon would jump in. I've been asked this question many times, and I think in the medical literature, there's not been a study designed that would tell us the idea that grounding has electrophysical properties that impart to you. But there's lots of evidence that taking that moment and being mindful of what you're feeling and where you're at does impart a calm and serenity and peace in the, capital P kind of sense that is definitely affecting the neurotransmitters in your brain and in a way that lasts a little bit longer. And then when you're in the trees and the phytoncides, the chemicals that Dr. Tandon was talking about, when you've breathed those in as well, those effects on your brain, your nervous system last for a month afterwards. The studies in Japan are crazy about lowered blood pressure and cortisol, your stress hormones and whatnot. So it's not that it's hard to say what that mindful moment when you are putting bare feet on something, is it just being mindful and taking in the nature that we have been able to study, or is it something different that we haven't been able to study? Dr. Tan, do you have anything to add to that?
So I read this fascinating study. It's been at least a decade, but it was by Tracy Alloway and her husband, who's a physiologist. She's a psychologist. And so it was a study on working memory. Mm-hmm. And so she compared running barefoot on the beach with running in shoes on a treadmill, and the ability to remember. And so the group that actually ran barefoot on the beach was able to recall more items than the group that ran in shoes on the treadmill. And and NIH actually funded that study. And I was so fascinated because I thought, well, what are we actually going to do with that information? But it is fascinating. And so then it does make me go, what is the mechanism of action there, right? And so there's something happening. There's something happening.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of these studies are not easy to do. And I think that's why. So sometimes when we don't have a sort of scientific evidence for something, it's not that it doesn't exist. It's just that either that study hasn't been done, or those measures are hard to capture. And And as you can imagine, certainly in children, there's extra levels of complexity in doing these research. So some of those things I think just we don't have the evidence for, but it may be that it just hasn't been done in the way for us to understand it yet.
Sure. And I don't think I think it's good to think about things in a different way. Just this topic of nature and child health is a completely different lens to look at child health, well-being, and development for pediatricians. It's been around forever, but it's just a different lens. And it's always good to, I think, keep your mind open to slicing this idea of growing the best humans we can in a different way, because that may motivate and help the process.
Yeah, Dr. Glassy, let's go back to what you were talking about developmental milestones and how being in nature helps families promote that. What does that look like at different ages and stages for parents?
Yeah, as a pediatrician with my, 30 plus years helping families with their kids and watching their, having the privilege to watch their developmental milestones, I love it, as I did as a parent too. The child that is taking those first few steps and falling and doing it for a while and getting frustrated and going to something else, but coming back and then the next day going farther. That's so fascinating to watch. And we do know that there's a role for parents to play in promoting that. Kids left alone don't develop the same way that kids who are interacted with. So the example of language, the more you talk to a baby, the better and more complex and earlier their language and communication skills develop. And so nature gives you this exquisite backdrop to promote that. Oh, look at the clouds. Those fluffy white things are blowing. Do you feel that wind on your cheek? There's so many words you're using there, and the baby is relating to them in ways that they might not indoors. So bringing along the language, and then for children who maybe are not really loving school, I'm going to jump to an older age. We feel real strong that infants, newborns need to get outside, and you need to be interacting with them physically and verbally and whatnot. But of course, your older child who maybe is perhaps struggling with their writing. What should I write about? I don't like to write. It hurts my hand. A change in venue, get outside and give them a fun decorated piece of paper or notebook and go and color or draw. Ask them what they're drawing about, and then ask them to describe it, and then say, could you write those words on there too? I mean, there's just so much more you can do to promote that development. And the third one, of course, is healthy, resilient children need to have strong social emotional skills, and your interaction with your child in nature, that promoting your relational health. Nature makes it easier. There's less conflict, there's more interest, there's more shared interest. As you get into the teen years, you're scrambling to find that common ground. Nature can often provide that.
Would you include like a safe risk-taking component to it in building confidence and in their skills and abilities as they grow as well?
Yes, 100%. And I think part of that is the motor skill piece. So, we talked about language and fine motor and social emotional, but gross motor skills are another, I think, way that being in nature can help children of all ages. So even thinking about, a kid playing on a plastic play structure, which is the most commonly found in playground, and everything is equidistant and predictable, and maybe it's exciting the first few times, but especially if that's in your preschool or schoolyard, there's not a lot that you can do to vary that up or to advance your motor skills. But then, imagine a log, a 2-year-old trying to balance themselves on a log or jump from, one rock to another. The running in sort of that open space and picking up speed in ways that you can't indoors. balancing. So many of those, and they're called fundamental movement skills, like that's literally the word, or developing physical literacy is possible in ways outdoors and in nature when things are less predictable, when there are, we call them loose parts, when you can play with pine cones and sticks and grass and create things and bring in your creative elements. The motor skill opportunity is immense and riskier than indoors, right? So when a little one's trying to climb onto a log and maybe it's a little slippery and the rock is a little higher than they've gone on before, can they make that jump, across a puddle? And so, and we think, and people have studied this, that small amounts of age appropriate risk, maybe initially with adult guidance and then stepping away, are important. I mean, children have to take risks. They have to take physical risks, intellectual risks their whole lives. And what a wonderful way to help prepare them for that. So I think that the movement and the risk taking is really important part of their development.
I like that, because it also grows their confidence that something scary or perhaps bad, they fell 6 times. Do they really want to try that again? They have to make that decision and do it and then feel good about it. So there's so many life skills that start with that kind of curated risky play. But all these things we've been talking about is how you can parent like a list. You're doing these things with your kids outside. I also want to put a plug for free play in here, because creativity and learning to manage boredom and all these other life skills we know are really important for kids to have uncurated, unadult directed time, so they can let their imaginations go, creativity grow, manage the risk on their own, again, curated way. So free play, please remind your listeners that even though we have all these suggestions for what they should be doing with their children outside, simply just letting them loose in a safe-ish environment in nature is just as important, and probably every day need to have that free play time too.
All right, so I want to go back to something that you just said about things being scary. So quick story, one of my kids was scared of anything that flies, right? If it flies, it's scary. And so one time he was about 5, and they went to the swimming pool in our neighborhood with the neighbors. And within 20 minutes, she had brought him home and said he is terrified of the flies and would not engage. And so she dropped him off and went back to the pool with her kids. So how do we talk to kids about the scary things that are outside without scaring them, right? Like, what does that language look like? Just how do we talk to them about the fears about nature?
There are, in kids 5 and under especially, there are specific times when kids are known to be afraid. Remember stranger anxiety for that 9-month-old, or it comes back again, the 15 to 18-month-old is stay away, hands off. And so the answer to helping children through fear, maybe an irrational fear, we should probably preface, they should be afraid of some things, but maybe an irrational fear that you want to help them through depends on their age. So for a 5-year-old, verbal, can understand the future, can understand the past, that kind of preschool age, you would maybe, in that case, I bet they were terribly disappointed that they couldn't be at the swimming pool, and clearly got the message that mom was gonna go have fun without them. That's what I would maybe address first, is feelings of, wow, you must be so disappointed because you're not at the pool with them, and I know you're so afraid of flies, and maybe we should talk about that. And then you have to listen. You really have to know if they're ready for it. because as you know, in psychology, sometimes revisiting your traumas is just more traumatizing, and sometimes it's a growth opportunity. So you have to really listen and engage, and maybe it's not right then, maybe it's tomorrow that you talk about it again. But then little by little, reading books about kids, certainly from a safe distance, maybe through the window, talking about what's a fly, what's a bee, looking at maybe videos of kids and beekeepers and things. My granddaughter was afraid. She got her first bee sting, and then every little insect that was flying around her, she would be shrieking and having a lot of problem being outside. But gradually, through talking about that and differentiating and understanding even when bees were near, to be on alert, but really just take a beat, she got there. And it was little by little, and my son and daughter-in-law listening to her and talking about it. Pooja, I bet you have some stuff to add.
I think you covered it really, but I guess the way I was thinking of is really understanding what about it is making them worried. Sometimes I think, we imagine what it is that's, bothering a child, but until we ask, we don't know for sure. And often it's easier than we thought. And then, we talk in the book about, being in nature doesn't have to look like the same thing for everyone. And so, there may be ways to avoid flying things for a period of time and finding other opportunities to spend time in nature, or finding a reason to be there, if it's a friend's birthday celebration, or going, as children get older, their peer group becomes so much more important. And so sometimes having a friend kind of convince them to come along might help have them get over their fears or their concerns.
So we need to take a break and let Sandy read a word from our sponsor. And when we come back, I just want you to give our listeners some tips on what to do indoors to bring nature inside, especially, I live in Colorado where it snows 9 months out of the year. So there are many times where our nature is covered up. And so what can parents do when, being outside isn't an option all year? When we come back.
Aaron's dream is to play lacrosse at a Division I university, but he was struggling so much academically that he worried it might not happen. But things changed after he completed cognitive skills training at Learning RX. He became independent in managing his assignments and homework and studying for exams. His grades improved so much that he was accepted into his dream high school to play lacrosse. His mom says, tutoring is a Band-Aid. It's not really going to fix the underlying issues. Learning RX has just been a complete lifesaver. While your child may or may not achieve these same results, Learning RX would be happy to work with you to get answers about your child's struggles with learning. Get started at learningrx.com or head to our show notes for links to more helpful resources.
Again, I love hearing those success stories, Sandy. Thanks for sharing that. So talk to us a little bit about how we can bring nature indoors and have some green experiences inside, and how it doesn't always have to be outdoors. Or if I'm wrong, tell me.
Well, I can start first with the part about, if it's snowing 9 months out of the year, or around here in the Northwest, it's raining 9 months out of the year, or, heat in other parts of the country. So weather is one of the biggest challenges we hear about. And I think moving indoors is one part of the strategy, but I would also encourage, outdoor time in ways that fit the weather. And I think it is possible year round in most settings. And that might mean, making sure you're bundled up. There's that idea that there's no such thing as bad weather, just inappropriate clothing or, preparation or something. So I think that if you're bundled up, and often, we've talked to teachers who are preschool, like nature school teachers, where children are outdoors for the entire day, regardless of the weather. And they talk about that, like being geared up in the right way, taking breaks, taking, water breaks if it's too hot, being in the shade, coming indoors when it is getting too hot or too cold. So that would be part one, is to really think about what are the fun things that you can do in the snow or, in the rain, but while staying, safe and healthy. And then, indoors, the easiest one is bringing plants indoors in terms of, having potted plants, and what a great way to work with the little one on talking about seeds and growing food and caring for a plant. So that would be one thing, is actually growing the plant. Another one would be bringing nature from outside indoors. And so that might be, going outside and collecting leaves. If they in the autumn, if that's something that's a seasonal change in your area, pressing flowers, bringing in rocks and painting them, creating different sorts of crafts, journaling, and drawing pictures of what's visible from your window or from a porch or a deck, and looking at the clouds, looking at the sky. Those are some ideas that come to mind. Danette, I'm sure you have others that you have to share.
Yeah, I think also don't limit yourself to daytime kind of observing nature through the window. The nighttime sky is important. And being outside at night as well. I think getting kids outside at night and making them comfortable about observing through their other senses. Like, what do we smell at night? Does it smell different? What do we hear? Maybe even starting to study the stars or the moon's phases, constellations, depending on the age of the kid. And then of course you can do a lot of that just from your window. So that's another way to not limit yourself to what we usually think of as 2 p.m. at the park as your nature time, or some immersive camping experience. That's what springs to people's mind, but really it's going to be way more accessible if you free yourself to think about nature in all these ways. Dr. Tandon was the one who knew of a grandma who would scoop up snow and bring it in a big bucket for kids to play with indoors, because the grandma couldn't go outside when it was snowy and icy. Again, be creative. And I'm sure that's about 1/10 of the things that people can do that we've just talked about.
All right, so I have 2 questions. One, can you talk a little bit about the benefits of having your hands in soil? I think you mentioned something about that in the book. And so obviously you can have your hands in soil inside as well if you're doing urban gardening or indoor gardening. So that's question number 1. And then question number 2 is, Dr. Tandon, you mentioned breathing those essential oils from the trees. Do you get that same benefit from bottled essential oils, diffusing them? Okay, 2 questions.
Yeah, I'll take the second one first. I don't think I could speak to the evidence on the bottled essential oils. I mean, the studies on the forests and phytoncides have been done in forests. And so I would say that the best way, or the most convincing evidence on the benefits to the immune system, because it does need to be, I would say, immersive in a way, is probably going to come from being in a forest.
And just before you go on, essential oils, sometimes those diffusers are sending out the little spray of oil that, for little kids especially, they're breathing so much faster than us and their lungs are so much smaller that they're getting irritated linings of their lungs, and it can be harmful to them. So yeah, I go outside if you want some essential oils with a little child. Go ahead.
I just know that we'll have listeners that would have thought that
I know
when you said it. And so I wanted your expert opinion then for them.
No, that's a good clarifying point. And then to the part about the soil. So, that I would say, there are some people have written about this idea that that part of the reason, there's this idea of the hygiene hypothesis, like part of the reason that there are more, allergies and immune system problems in people today is because our environments have become too sterile, that children are growing up without the exposure to the the microbes and things that help build our immune system from a young age. And so when we think about it in that way, spending time outdoors, so not necessarily, I would say, or I don't think I could quote a specific study about hands in soil specifically, but just this idea that spending time in nature, there's some that, spending time on farms or around animals, sort of being in the natural environment, may be important for building up our immune system and our immunity and sort of the natural way that our body can fight off infections. And then when we don't get that, maybe that's part of the theory of why there are more immune system problems. As far as that happening indoors, so I think that's, a plausible theory that if you are getting that same sort of exposure to natural environments and it's indoors, that it probably also can confer benefits. That made me think of one other thing that we get sometimes asked about is this idea of virtual nature. Like, do images of nature or nature books, for example, as when we think about being indoors and nature exposure, do they have benefits as well? And, I think the evidence is still, I would say, unclear on that, although there are studies where they've looked at VR, like virtual nature in adults, and like, for example, somebody who, because of their physical limitations, may not be able to go to a national park or something that, and then when they're seeing it on a VR headset, it evokes certain emotions and certain benefits that, either make them think of their childhood or the restorative benefits of nature. So I think, our thoughts on this are real outside nature is better. Like, we want children and families to spend their time outside as much as possible. And there probably are some benefits that come from virtual nature or images of nature. There are studies that looking at nature through windows, for example, is beneficial. Sharing books with nature. So it's better than nothing. And so we would still encourage, families that if there are barriers or challenges to getting outdoors, to do what you can indoors, even if it's, sharing a book about nature or looking at pictures of nature, but when possible, get outside.
I think it's worth mentioning one more thing about getting your hands dirty and growing a garden, whether it's indoors or outdoors. And that is, you remember how frustrating it is when your child refuses to eat what you just put in front of them. Everybody experiences that. And some kids are really turned off by, of course, vegetables. So the studies are overwhelmingly positive in that if the child helped grow the vegetable, they're more likely to try them. So what another great parenting hack there to get your kids to eat a little more veggies. And if the only space you have to do that, gardening and getting your hands dirty and doing that, get their kids in to working on that, is indoors, great. Why not?
Yeah, we had raised gardens when my kids were little, and they loved helping plant those vegetables, tend those vegetables, harvest those vegetables, and of course, prep and eat those. So I can absolutely attest to, hey, I helped make that, right? And so of course I want to eat it. My middle kid was such a picky eater that he would have never tried a pepper had he not grown it himself. And so absolutely, I love
Good
that
job.
recommendation.
Yeah.
So we are nearly out of time. What would you like to say to our listeners that you haven't gotten to say?
I would just say, we know how busy your day is, but we hope we've convinced you a little bit about maybe some of the areas that you are spending your time in with your children. You can maybe do outdoors and get the double benefit of outdoor nature exposure and your parenting out there. And that to remember to lean on your people around you and your community, and fight for those green spaces in your area where you can, on your childcare, your schoolyards, your community parks, because we all could use that, including you, parents.
And I'll say that we think that everyone belongs in nature. We think that everyone deserves that opportunity. And so children, parents, grandparents, need to find what that means for them, and it doesn't have to look the same. It can be just your backyard, or it could be, you know, camping in a national park, but find what that means for you. Take little steps to maybe expanding what nature time means for your family. And yes, definitely lean on your friends and your nature allies and nature mentors to help make that possible.
And if our listeners want to follow more of your work, where can they find you?
We have of course, our book is coming out after October 15th. That's going to be available in most places where you get a book. But also Project Nature WA.com is where we've put resources for the families whose pediatricians are trying to send this message more. And from there, there's many other links to national groups that are helping families get out in nature. I think you'll find in our book too, tons of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So listeners, we will put a link to projectnaturewah.com in our show notes, along with a link for you to purchase Digging into Nature, Outdoor Adventures for Happier and Healthier Kids in our show notes as well. So Dr. Danette Glassy, Dr. Pooja Tandon, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to share these exciting insights from your practices, from your experience, and from your book. Listeners, thank you for being with us today. If you like us, please pull out your phones right now and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at the Brainy Moms. If you like our show, we would love it if you would leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. If you would rather see our faces, we are on YouTube at the Brainy Moms, and you can find Sandy demonstrating cognitive skills on TikTok at the Brain Trainer Lady. Look, that is all the smart stuff we have for you today, so we're going to catch you next time.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.